In this chapter, we're going to be discussing the big picture concepts of volume, intensity, and frequency and their interdependent nature. If you want to know the stats of any given program, what stimulus and what stress it imposes upon you, that's described by these three factors. And they're interdependent factors. We can't separate them as much as sometimes we like to, and they absolutely need to be balanced between each other to find the optimal approach to programming. So what are they? Well, volume is the total amount of work you're doing. I'll explain in a future chapter how we quantify this more specifically and the rationale, but for the purposes of this course, that's just simply the number of working sets you're doing for a given muscle group. Quantifying volume is important because it tells us a few things. It tells us the amount of practice you're getting with the movements you've chosen. It also tells you roughly the amount of stress and stimulus that you're getting. Meaning, we actually have data. We have research showing us that there's a positive relationship between the number of sets per week per muscle group and hypertrophy, how much you're growing. But it's not a linear relationship. It actually diminishes over time. So there's absolutely such a thing as doing too much and potentially an amount of volume that's counterproductive. Now, on the other hand, we have intensity. Intensity is a word that you probably think of something related to being hardcore, but it also means specific things in terms of programming. It means your proximity to failure, which we quantify with RIR, repetitions in reserve, and also the load on the bar. RIR, simply put, is just a number, and it tells you how many out of the total possible repetitions you could get in a set did you leave in reserve. So a 0 RIR means you did as many reps as possible with a given load. And an RIR of 1 means you stopped one shy of doing as many reps as possible. If you were to try to do another rep after hitting a 0 RIR, you would fail mid-rep. You'd hit momentary muscular failure. So RIR plus a given target rep range tells us what load to choose. If I told you to do 8 reps at a 2 RIR, you'd choose your 10 rep max for the actual weight that you use, because you know that you'd do 8 reps out of a possible 10, requiring your 10 rep max. Now, intensity also needs to be quantified because it also tells us about the stress and the stimulus. As you train closer to failure, we are going to have an increased time course of recovery. We have data to show that it takes longer for muscle damage and soreness to dissipate and our ability to produce force to come back to baseline. But we also know that there's a positive relationship between proximity to failure and hypertrophy, just like there is for volume. As you get closer and closer to failure in all of your sets, we see greater growth. That's a pretty clear relationship between both volume and proximity to failure with the hypertrophy stimulus. Now, don't be like the typical bodybuilder and assume that you need to max out both, because I've told you they're both related to hypertrophy. They have an interdependent effect, which I'll explain more about in a bit, and that's where frequency comes in. Frequency is our tool to distribute and manage the total stress and stimulus that comes from volume and intensity. And as a bodybuilder, we simply describe frequency as the number of times per week that you train a given muscle group. So you might have a frequency of training chest 3 times per week, and legs maybe, or quads, 2 times per week, depending upon your individual needs. But we're also going to have a frequency of just the number of times that we step into the gym in a given week. So you're going to have muscle group frequency and also number of sessions per week. And the interaction between all of those variables tells us what are we actually going to do in the gym and how balanced is our program. And balance is an important thing because these are interdependent factors. I know I'm repeating myself, but it bears repeating. Like I said, don't be the typical bodybuilder who just simply thinks that every variable that possibly maximizes muscle growth must be turned up to the max, because that's univariate thinking. And that is a statistical term that just simply means that these two variables have a relationship that are unimpacted by anything else. But in reality, we're dealing with a multivariate relationship. Simply put, 1 plus 1 does not necessarily equal 2. Just because both volume and intensity are positively related to hypertrophy doesn't mean that they are additive in nature. There's a complex relationship between the two. In fact, the data, which I'll get into more in later chapters, suggests that as you do more volume, proximity to failure becomes less important, and vice versa. So it all comes down to balance. To give you a really simple way of thinking about how these variables impact each other, let me give you a few scenarios. We'll talk about junkies who are both volume junkies, intensity junkies, and frequency junkies, and we've met them all. People who like to train with a very high frequency, take all their sets to failure, or do all of the sets in the world. All three can work, and they all potentially could be optimal in different circumstances and for a given person, but they all are separate choices because they impact other factors. So you can't do all the volume, all the intensity, and all the frequency. That's just called overtraining. So let's discuss each one. The volume junkie. Let's say you're doing 10 sets per muscle group in a given workout. That's going to require you to take a lower frequency per muscle group so you have time to recover. Also, if you don't want to see your reps drop off set to set or the load drop off, you're going to have to train further from failure if you're going to take that approach and do a very high volume per session approach. Now, if you were to do the intensity junkie, if you were going to take every single set to failure, you know that your reps are going to drop off set to set. You know, if you want to maintain the same rep target and still train to failure, that the load's going to drop off. You also know that there's going to be an increased time course of recovery. So that could also potentially drop frequency. So if you maximize volume and become the volume junkie, or you maximize intensity and become the intensity junkie, they affect one another and potentially reduce frequency. Finally, if you want to train every single muscle group every single day, you need to do a lower volume or lower intensity on those days. So if you're the frequency junkie coming in to train every single session, you're probably not going to failure, and you're probably only doing a few sets per muscle group. And if your first thought is, well, which one's best? You're missing my point. These are interdependent factors, and the balance between them that is ideal for you is what we want to find. And that's what we're going to go over in our subsequent chapters.